So I think there's always some really interesting questions when we look at social, cultural, political change in the 1960s. Um, there are really clear and straightforward ways in which we can trace a growing liberalisation, a growing permissiveness. We can look at some of the legislative changes in this period that really point to a loosening of some of those older understandings around deference, around the role of the state, the role of authority. It's also really important to recognise the limits of the interpretation of this period in British history as a time of permissiveness. For instance, the 1957 Wolfenden Report on homosexuality and prostitution, this actually tightens the regulation of prostitution in this country. And we also need to note that it takes 10 years between the Wolfenden Report and the change in the law. So that isn't obviously an immediate change, but a more gradual shift. So this is evidence of the ways in which the story, the narrative of permissiveness is perhaps more complicated than we might initially think. It's also really useful to think about some of the limits that there are in terms of an interpretation of permissiveness. Not everybody can be seen as part of this, being involved with it, wanting to be engaged with it. For instance, we do see reaction from many moral commentators, church groups and so on, who push back against this tide of permissiveness. For instance, in relation to things like television viewing, questions of obscenity, questions of what's permissible in terms of popular culture. So this is evidence of a pushback, and the fact that this continues through the period on into the 80s and indeed beyond is evidence that permissiveness isn't just a straightforward story. And we can also very much think about some of the continued social stigma that there is. For instance, in terms of gay men, it's by no means the case that after the 1967 decriminalisation that all forms of prejudice dissipate. That absolutely isn't the case. We can also think about groups like women who have children outside marriage. That remains something where there's a lot of social stigma, arguably up to the 1980s in many communities. So the whole question of social change in the 60s and social liberalisation is a more complex story than perhaps we might initially think.